Welcome to Powering the Future Within, the podcast where we explore the breakthroughs shaping the future of MedTech. I'm Omari Bouknight, CEO of Resonant Link Medical. Each episode, we speak with founders, engineers, clinicians, and visionaries who are driving the next wave of medical innovation, advancing technologies that are smarter, less invasive, and more connected than ever. This is where the future of health takes shape. Let's dive in. Today, I'm joined by Karl Stoklosa. Karl is a seasoned MedTech leader and CEO of PRECISIS, a company pioneering next-generation neurostimulation for epilepsy care. With more than 25 years of experience in bringing novel brain and cardiac-focused technologies to global markets, Karl is driving PRECISIS' mission to advance treatment options for patients with drug-resistant epilepsy. I couldn't be more excited to have Karl on the show. Welcome, Karl.
Thanks, Omari. Great to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
My pleasure. Likewise. And I understand you're taking this from Heidelberg, Germany. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. So the office is based in Heidelberg, Germany. It was founded back in 2014 by our founder and former CEO, Angela Liedler. And really on that idea of having a technology that could treat patients in a less invasive fashion. So not penetrating the skull in the case for the treatment of focal cortical stimulation, and really offering patients an alternative to additional drugs for drug refractory patients, and also for an alternative to more invasive surgical interventions. So really excited to be in this role and leading this team.
Yeah, and I can't wait to dig in and hear more about it. But maybe just to start with, would love to hear more about you. We've obviously known each other for quite some time, and you have a very interesting background and path that brought you to MedTech. So why don't you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself and what got you into this field that you are so passionate about?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had a very deep interest in medicine, and early, even back when I was very young, took jobs in hospitals and was an emergency medical tech. And as I went through my initial years of college, was considering medicine, but then also fell in love and had a passion for history and for international travel and exposure and cultures. So ended up getting a medieval history degree, but really wanted to continue. When I looked and reflected on what I could do from a long-term career perspective, kind of went back into the idea that medical device could be an interesting path. And as I finished my executive MBA with the University of Chicago, really began to explore what that opportunity would look like, and was very fortunate to get some really good early advice from people I knew in the medical device field to start my career in the field, and in particular supporting implants, and in this case, cardiac rhythm management implants. And that gave me very intimate exposure, not only to clinicians and clinician needs, but also to patients. And what's really insightful there is, patients are overwhelmed. They have this big decision to make, to be treated, and all of a sudden they're being told they have a condition that they have to treat, and it has to be done surgically. And that's very scary for them. And the ability to help support them on that initial journey and educate them and make them aware of what their device is capable of, and to give them that reassurance was really a great foundation. And then as part of that, learning what physicians needed from us as device representatives and as a technology was also really important. Understanding their challenges, not only in the implant but in the follow up and the long term management of patients. So that early exposure was really important. Um, as I mentioned before, I have always had a passion for international, and so I had a decision to make. If I stayed in the field in sales, I would have had to stay likely at that time in the United States. So I made the decision to move into marketing and gain some experience and leverage those skills and understandings in new product development marketing. And that was an interesting area because you're really instead of being the representative of the company to the physician, you're really representing the physician's needs to the company. And that was uh really eye-opening, and sometimes physicians know what they want, but other times you have to probe and get at the real core need or unmet need that they have in order to guide R&D in the right decisions and the right types of therapies that they or technologies that they would utilize for treatment. So those are early stage. Um, that obviously allowed me to leverage and then work my way into international markets. And that's where I spent actually probably the last 17 plus years of my career.
Mm. So, a medieval historian with a passion for medicine.
Yes.
I couldn't think of a better location than Heidelberg for those two.
It, that's exactly correct. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And I love what you talked about in terms of starting with representing the technology to the market and then flipping the script and representing the market to the organizations, to the companies. And you've probably learned just an incredible amount from both sides of those learnings.
Yeah, I mean it's really fundamental. There's not any one data point that gives you the right answer, and it's a lot of it's obviously you can quantify feedback and so on, but it's a bit of a trade-off between art and science. And then when you're getting into the development cycle, then it's what is the engineering team capable to do in the right amount of time with the right limitations on cost and other factors, right? To bring a good product or new feature to market. So those are all really interesting dynamics that I learned early on in kind of the new product development side of things.
Yeah. And I mean, when you think about the study of history, for example, it's basically the examination of humanity.
Yeah.
And I have to imagine that the skills that you build examining humanity populations actually are beneficial in understanding how patients experience things and then translating that to solutions and how solutions could actually impact us as humans.
Yeah. Couldn't have actually said it better myself. Actually, I'll probably steal that from you. But no, I mean, there's that aspect of it as is fundamental to building or developing new solutions for patients and the physicians that are treating those patients. But it also extends to a deeper. It extends to leading international teams or leading multicultural teams, and that's something that I've purposely and intentionally looked for in my career. Um, Working in different cultural dynamics does create its own set of challenges. And you have to learn to navigate those and learn to navigate personalities in a different way than staying in a singular culture.
Yeah. And what drives you towards that? Is it the challenge itself? Is it the learning? Is there anything particular that you find interesting about engaging in multicultural centers and in multicultural environments? Because
Yeah.
it can be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's not always easy, but I think I what I think I bring to it is a broad understanding and the ability to bring folks together in a unique manner. Understanding the dynamics of different cultures. I don't always get it right, obviously. On the other hand, what I get out of it is the wonderful experience of when you bring together these cross cultural groups and functions, not only functions, but groups of culturally different, diverse people, and get them working on a common goal. And ultimately, for us, that common goal is better solutions or better treatment for patients who are at their end of treatment pathway and really don't have good solutions. And that is really awesome to have and to see. And really that's what energizes me, and the ability to help guide people through cultural dynamics, frustrations, or miscommunications, and help smooth those over to have a high performing team is really what drives me in a leadership sense.
Yeah. So you started your med tech career in the US. You moved to Europe.
Yep.
You then took on leadership roles in Asia.
Yep.
You came back to the US,
Yep.
and now you're back in Europe again. Does that mean Asia is next on the circle of Carl's life?
So who knows? Probably this is one of the areas I'll stay for a little bit longer. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in this space, and the neuromodulation is really at a pivotal point in development. And so I think there's a lot of work and aspects that can be resolved here, and I think there's time enough for me to do that, and who knows? But right now, I mean, international moves are always a challenge, but and that dynamic, you have to have a willing family and a willing spouse, right? So if you're talking about a family decision, it is not an easy pathway, and you have to have that willingness of the family to participate in that journey. Otherwise, it becomes very challenging as you go.
Yeah, you hit on something that I think is very exciting, which we are at a pivot point, it feels like, in the space of neuromodulation. And you started your work in neuromodulation pretty early on, not that far after its infancy. So started out in cardiac stimulation devices, but you pivoted to neuromodulation pretty early on. And I'm just curious, what are your views if you were to compare and contrast cardiac versus neuro focused technologies?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, I mean, cardiac as a especially cardiac rhythm management has been a therapy that's been around for quite a number of years now. I would say it's fairly mature, although it's reinvented itself quite nicely in the form of leadless pacing, left bundle area pacing, and other heart failure solutions, quite nicely. Um, but I think there's only so much more that can be done in that realm. The area of neurostimulation and neuromodulation, especially the focus on the brain and brain stimulation, is really, I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's still a lot of unknowns, right? And that's what's really interesting for me is the fact that there's so many areas that are unknown, and so much potential to do more good for patients, not only in epilepsy, but potentially other indications, right? Depression or stroke. These are all areas that neurostimulation can have a potential benefit in. And so that's what excites me about this field is it's really at its infancy. And I think there's technology and tools that enable this kind of new wave of neurostimulation. Obviously, you've got the bigger BCI plays uh, going on, new types of lead technology or fiber technology to get into the brain. But AI is a big one, right? The ability to process the significant amount of data that's coming out of the cortex and then understand that data and create treatment pathways for whatever indication you're going after, is not something that a few years ago would have been possible, right? So that's really exciting.
Right. No, absolutely. And would love to dig into that more. And as we do, talk to us a little bit about your decision to move from larger organizations. You were in the US in your previous role to make a pretty big jump to run this very novel technology, this novel company across the ocean as a startup CEO. So what did that decision process look like for you?
So I've been looking for quite a long time at what the next part of my career would look like, and I've often thought about uh, startups and smaller companies, and intentionally many years ago I set out to build the skills and understanding of global markets with the intention of being able to add value to companies that are commercializing products globally. That was intentional. I had a 5-year plan for Europe, turned into 11 years, and I had a 3, 4 year plan for Asia, which was exactly 3 years. And that, I mean, I got deep exposure in Europe, very deep exposure to reimbursement systems, healthcare systems, uh, uh, employment systems, which are dynamic. And then also in Asia, I can't say I got as deep into the Asian markets, but enough to understand them sufficiently to, I think, begin to know where to ask the right questions. Large companies, they provide scale, they have deep resources, they have processes, um, but that also comes with less agility, the ability to pivot. And what I was looking for is how could I, as with my experience, make a deeper impact in an organization and take on areas that I don't know as well. Reimbursement globally, regulatory globally, and then on the investor side, investor relations and investor and outreach. Those are areas that I didn't have as much experience in. And so coming to a company like Precisis, um, you know, that these types of startups thrive on agility and innovation. You have to do more with less, and you have to look at how you're utilizing your resources, and then the other thing that it it requires is sharp focus, right? With smaller cash available, you have to be focused on what you're doing. I mean,
Yeah.
the engineers would love to look at multiple indications, making sure that we're focused on the indication that we're commercializing is essential at our stage. And we need to definitely demonstrate that we can scale that. And then the money can flow and we can look at other potential indications. Um, I would say the biggest difference ultimately is mindset. We embrace in a startup environment a little bit more risk taking, adaptability, and there's benefit in the larger organization on execution and risk management. So the both environments are really shaping my leadership style, and I'm trying to bring more process to this startup and more structure. But on the other hand, I don't want to quelch or uh, limit the creativity and the speed of decision making that we have at the expense of process. So it's a little bit of a balance, and making sure that there's some discipline, but also making sure there's flexibility.
Right. Yeah.
So
And it strikes me as really interesting because from the outside in, the decision to take on this role with Precisis in the, outside of the US would seem to be a large risk. I think a lot of people would interpret that way. However, it sounds as though you had a lot of intention around building some building blocks into your career, which were almost small bites of risk over time that set yourself up for this position, this role, where you're still taking a little bit of a risk. You're still betting on yourself, but you had done that so many times before, it probably didn't feel as much as a jump as most people might anticipate that it would be.
Yeah, I would think that's correct, and I think, I mean, there's a number of things that I was exposed to that let me in my international career, in my U.S. career, that made me feel comfortable to take on the risk. But also, to your point, I mean, it's still, there's still risk. There's risk in startup, um, but understanding and feeling like I could manage some of that risk differently. So in my time at St. Jude and Abbott, I ran the neuromodulation sales organization for a period of time. If I hadn't had that exposure and experience, I might have second guessed whether I could help support and drive commercialization of this technology. Understanding reimbursement structure. It's so important. I mean, in medical device, there's so many great ideas that are developed that never really gain traction because they don't have the right reimbursement. Um, and there's still some risk there, but it's and knowing enough about the different dynamics of the different markets, and there are a lot of markets, uh, gave me the confidence that we could manage that risk as well. So, yes, I think what you were saying is correct. There are little different experiences throughout the last 17 years, in particular, that have reduced the amount of risk that I think I'm taking, even though there's still risk involved.
It's always the case, but
Yeah.
therein lies the opportunity and the fun, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk more about Precisis. You
Yes.
mentioned that it was established in 2014. You're
Yeah.
obviously targeting drug-resistant epilepsy, which is a huge, huge issue. So would love to hear more about the foundation of the company, the technology, and how you are going about trying to address this massive issue.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, the original concept of this was out of a lab in the United States, and it was conceived to say, can we stimulate the cortex without having an invasive intervention, so above the skull? And that idea and concept was brought to the founder through some connections with some investors in the United States, as well as Professor Andy Cole out of Harvard. And that there started the foundation of the idea. That led in 2016, 17 to some initial preclinical work with animals. And we did our first, and then our chief technology officer was hired in 2016, Michael Tittlebach. He's one of the managing directors with me in the organization. He's been with the company since 2016, and he has a lot of technical experience. He was uh, instrumental, actually led the drug-eluting stent development for Biotronic. So he knows deeply product development. So they took this idea of stimulation and implemented it into an electrode array, as well as a pulse generator. And that was then put into clinical study in 2019. And so there was a clinical study, feasibility study, that was expanded, and that started in 2019. The first patients implanted in that study were really deeply suffering. So these are patients that had been either suffering since adolescence and into their early adulthood, or older, but had been suffering for many years. So we're talking patients that have anywhere from 3 seizures per month to as many as 200 seizures per month.
Wow.
So these are patients that, there's 30 potential drugs out there for the treatment of epilepsy. And despite the fact that there are these 30 different potential anti-seizure medications, they were not getting adequate control of their seizures. And and that means they have uncertainty, that the next seizure could come at any moment. They're suffering social isolation. They're limited in job and educational opportunities because they feel very isolated or very it becomes very difficult for them to manage their disease.
Yeah.
And so having a solution which is minimally invasive that then can potentially give them a benefit through focal cortical stimulation is something novel. And so the first implantations, and some of the first implanted, one of them, Ibrahim, he actually said no to the procedure twice because it was new and he wasn't certain. But he's now one of our biggest poster children for the therapy. He's in his 20s now. He actually got the procedure right when he turned into as an adult, and he's seizure free now for 4 years. Um, and that's not everyone. Not everyone is seizure free. But he's a great example of what the full potential of the stimulation is, or the procedure and the implant is.
Right.
That allowed us to get CE mark, and we actually went through MDR,
Uh,
in which is quite a surprising thing for us to be able to do, and that was done
yeah, and
in.
maybe just explain for the audience what MDR means, in order
Yeah.
for you to get CE mark, and what does CE mark enable for you?
Yeah, back before, I forget exactly when MDR came into being. It was probably in the late 2020 teens. Medical Device Directive was a set of regulations for devices to be placed on the European market. And it was really a response to some pretty significant recalls that occurred back many years ago. Um, and so they spent a number of years, EU spent a number of years reimagining their medical certification process. And so they went from certification, a process that was maybe 90 pages, to well over 600 pages. So many, clinical evidence required, a lot of testing, a lot of other heavy requirements that were built into the MDR process. So much so that most medical device companies have pivoted their first implantations into the US market over the
Right.
European market.
Right.
We were very fortunate in that we were able to navigate that procedure, um, and receive our approval. That allowed us to start commercialization a bit earlier than was expected,
Okay.
and starting to generate revenue. And that started really in late 2023, and then into accelerated a bit more into 24 and now 25.
Right. And how did the company find its way to Europe? You mentioned that some of the original academic work was out of the US.
Yeah, so Angela Liedler, our founding CEO, she was based in Europe, and she had a lot of experience in the pharma industry, as well as her own medical companies that she had worked uh, in the past years. She took this idea and then brought it into PRECISIS, and really built the company around the idea. So bought the patent right at the time, and then further, with the help of Michael Tittlebach and the other engineers, built out a pretty robust IP around not only the electrode, but the underlying IPG technology, the implantable device technology.
And it's quite an accomplishment to have this de facto Europe approval
Yes.
via the MDR, because I know that when the regulations were going through, even the large companies, very large companies, were quite nervous about what the requirements were going to be and the timeline. So to be able to have navigated that as a small company says a lot. And I think it's great because as you describe the patient and what the patient has gone through, the number of specialists they've probably seen, the number of medications that they've probably received, and to have this sense of unknowing when the next seizure might come on is can be terrifying. And a lot of those afflicted with epilepsy are younger. And I think you were touching on that. A lot of times when we talk about implantable medical devices, we think about older populations, but it strikes me that the populations that Precisis is treating, it's probably a pretty broad range and many of them skewing to be quite younger.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. We're currently indicated for 18 and up, and we're actually almost completed enrollment in what we're calling the Easy for You study. It's a study to uh, evaluate the technology for treatment for patients 12 through 17. That trial should complete enrollment here early next year, and then we will hopefully begin to commercialize that sometime in the next in probably mid 2027. But that really will expand our ability to provide this solution at an earlier stage in the patient's treatment pathway. Um, Especially considering that as if you're a young patient, you're starting these very heavy anti-seizure medications, the complications or the side effects um, can be lifelong, right? And they can build up over time. Giving these types of younger patients the potential to consider an alternative to or an adjunct therapy to medication that's minimally invasive is really unique, right? Other alternative surgical interventions require craniotomy or require a permanent implant on the vagus nerve, and this our system does not require that invasiveness. It's still a minimally invasive implant, but it if the therapy is not successful or not having the desired effect, it can be entirely removed with only a scar remaining.
Right, right. Wow. And it sounds like you have been having some recent really big wins. Would love to talk about that. What's been going on at Precisis recently?
Yeah, so we've had some really exciting news recently. We just received in end of October, during the U.S. government shutdown, our approval for our IDE trial in the United States.
Congratulations.
We have thanks. It's the culmination of, I mean, this work started well before I joined the company. It's been in the works for probably 5 years to build up the dossier. We had breakthrough designation early on, had a number of Q-Sub meetings with the FDA, but then did our final and official submission in earlier this year in end of January. Promptly had our FDA our lead reviewer fired, and then 2 weeks later rehired, and so that was a little bit chaotic. But the FDA, I have to say, even during this period, they did a very good job of providing us on time the feedback. There were several iterations of discussions with them that ultimately led to an aligned and very positive outcome. Full approval, no conditions on anything that we've presented as far as our device safety as well as our protocol for the trial. So we'll begin first. Our desire is to begin first patient before mid-year next year.
Great. That's phenomenal. So this means you've received an IDE, an investigational device exemption, which provides you with the approval to start a clinical trial in the US. So for our US based audience, they can anticipate sometime next year that the Precisis technology will be in clinical trial here in the US.
Yeah, in fact, we're actively working to reach out to centers to participate in this. Our VP of Clinical Operations in the U.S. is actually doing a first site visit today, and the upcoming AES meeting in Atlanta. They're going to have a number of meetings to discuss with centers the participation in our trial. It is our first. It will be our first randomized control trial. So we will, and the beauty of our therapy, and this is something I didn't mention before, is our therapy actually, the treatment is actually sub-perception. So when you're titrating up or you're doing the turn on after the implant, you have a healing period of about a month, and then you turn on the device. You're turning up so the patient can feel the tingling of the energy. But then for the treatment, you're lowering that to perception below perceptive level. So that allows us in the trial to actually implant everyone, do the same protocol for everyone, but for the sham group, we simply turn the therapy down below perception or below therapeutic voltage. And that will allow them to mimic all the other aspects of the treatment. And then at 6 months after we've taken that 6 month data point, we turn on the sham group and follow all patients for another 12 months. So the total trial time is 18 months, with the primary endpoint being at 6 months. And it's a mean seizure reduction between the treatment arm and the sham control group.
Right, right. Because earlier you mentioned the number of seizures that a patient could have in a given week or month. So the reduction, if you're moving from hundreds to tens or tens to single digits is very, very significant in terms of the impact on quality of life.
Yeah, it is. So in the study, I think the minimum number of seizures per month is 5 or 4, sorry. And then I think I don't know if there's an upper boundary on that. And what we find is that even if patients aren't what we would consider a responder. In our clinical trial in Europe, a responder was somebody who had a 50% or greater reduction in their seizures. So if you have 10 a month, you have to go to 5 or less, right? But there were some patients that didn't meet that criteria, but they had some benefit. And what we saw is that it would regularize when their seizures occurred. So instead of, for example, seizures throughout the day, the seizures would now be clustered either in the morning or for example, in the morning. And that allowed them better control over, even though they're not meeting that criteria of, responder as is classified by the clinical study, um, they were able to control and manage their day better, right? So that gives them better confidence that their seizures occur in the morning in this case, and then throughout the remainder of the day, they can be in effect seizure free or less likely to have seizures. Um, yeah, so it's interesting how the stimulation affects different people. In the end, we don't know really. There's no marker that says one patient will be a responder or benefit versus somebody else. We're doing some additional clinical work with physician-initiated studies to better understand that and to see if there are markers, but that's still investigation that we need to better understand.
Absolutely. And it was interesting what you said about how the trial design essentially allows every patient to receive the therapy. You just have the ability to turn it on or off. So essentially have a control group with the therapy eventually it can be turned on. So that's a great element of the trial design, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually effectively simulated on simulated off, because we also have a part of our therapy which is patient controlled, right? Because patients, so we have different stimulation patterns. One is intended to work as a depression of the epileptic focus, and then the other is a higher frequency stimulation, which is meant to disrupt any potential uh, seizure events throughout the course of the day. Now, a patient can also manage that themselves. The patient can actually have a bolus of stimulation through a patient activator. So this activator allows them, if they feel an aura or an onset, they can actually hit the button and it
Oh,
will
wow.
create a high frequency stimulation to try and disrupt that impending episode. And what we've seen and heard from patients is it will have one or two effects. One, it can actually disrupt it, or what it can do is reduce the intensity or the length or the time frequency. So those are all areas that can benefit from that patient interaction. And with the trial, we actually still provide that interaction, and so it truly simulates if the patient was actually having the therapy, it will simulate that in that aspect of it as well,
Yeah, and
without retreating them.
I love the concept of restoring control to the patient because it feels as though with this patient profile in particular, epilepsy and seizures are completely out of their control. And that has to be a very scary feeling. So to be able to restore control at some level has to be very empowering for these patients.
It is, and it's not just the patient, it's also their family or caregiver, because a lot of these patients, they need support. And that, if they're not able to trigger the bolus, their caregiver can trigger the bolus of stimulant, right? So, there's a lot of the sense of security that the patient gets from that ability and that control, but also the caregivers that are responsible for these patients as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's very important because it's not just the patient's journey, it's everyone who's taking the journey with them.
Yeah, everyone, the family, the spouse. I mean, I was mentioning Ibrahim. He went from many, many seizures a day, depressed, isolated, not able to do the things he wanted to do, soccer, and he didn't know what his future would be like. And now he's in his 20s, mid 20s. He's engaged to be married. He's studying to be a police officer, and he's able to go out and actually play football, soccer, uh, on a regular basis with his brother, and he actually can also drive a car. And these are things that, if he was not under control, many of these things would be out of reach for him. And so that, I mean, he becomes now a productive, positive member of society. And there's a benefit to society in that.
Yeah, and that's an aspect that we haven't touched on, but I've heard you speak about it before. That with these types of interventions, if you think about the lifetime effect or benefit for the patient, keeping them out of the hospital, there's also probably an economic argument here in terms of the benefit to the healthcare system more broadly. Obviously, we appreciate and it's enough to have that sort of benefit accrue to the patient, but there's also potentially a broader societal and economic benefit here there too.
Yeah, it's something we've evaluated, and it is quite impactful. And we're going to study that specific aspect even more in detail with our clinical trial. And we'll write up evidence to demonstrate the benefit of such a therapy in potential reduction of medication, potential of seizures that are emergent, that require hospitalization. That's expensive. Um, uh, Additional visits to their clinician, but also multiple additional lifetime medications, and that's significantly high cost.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. There's the immediate uh, cost benefit because our procedure is shorter, more predictable than other surgical procedures, but there's the longer term benefit that patients that payers have because these patients have fewer epileptic episodes, fewer needs for medications and hospitalizations over their lifetime. And again, we're talking about young patients, so they're going to live 25, 30, 40 years, right? This is
Yeah,
not it's not these are patients that if without this type of alternative, they are potentially a cost burden to that payer for many, many years to come.
right. So you're obviously in the early phase of ramping up for this major U.S. trial, but
Yeah.
what do you anticipate will be the requirements for someone to be able to enroll? What type of patients?
Yeah, it's going to be those with an epileptic focus, an identified focus. We in our clinical trial work, we didn't require sophisticated workups or highly interventional workups. It's simple EEG and then translating where that is to a surgical to the neurosurgeon. So that's a pretty low barrier. Again, minimum number of seizures. I think it's 4 is the minimum, and there's probably an outward bound of 2 to 300 maximum. Um, and then just they have to have been refractory on 2 drugs. So they have to be drug resistant on 2 or more anti-seizure medications. Those are kind of the high level uh, requirements for a patient to be included in.
Yeah, it seems like a fairly broad set of inclusion criteria, and certainly a number of patients out there that could potentially benefit. Earlier, you mentioned a term that I wanted to come back to, which is that the technology has received a breakthrough designation. What does that mean to you and to Precisis?
So it's helpful because it allowed us to have a deeper and more regular interaction with the FDA. And it also allows us the ability to connect that with a reimbursement code to because our study is classified as a B IDE trial, and that with a category 3 code which we established allows us to begin to establish a reimbursement pathway in the United States, and that's very important. This is particularly important for us is because of a comment you made earlier. A lot of times, for implantable devices, the patient population is a bit older, right? So they fall under Medicare or Medicare, uh, and for us, those patients, they could be anywhere from 18 years old all the way to 65, right, or 70. But the vast majority are in their 30s or 40s or 50s. They're not Medicare patients, right? They're going to be private pay or they're going to be on private health insurance or healthcare advantage, those types and so we need to establish ourselves and establish a code early on and make sure that work's done up front so that when we submit our PMA and we receive approval, we're not waiting a long time for payers to accept it um, as a viable therapy. And that's where the economic value proposition is really important, right? They're going to match it up against other technology that's available and already reimbursed, and they're going to say, "How is this better?" And does it if we can demonstrate efficacy that's at the same level as more invasive, then I think we win. And I have the feeling and I believe that we could actually demonstrate we're more efficacious. And in that case, we become the first choice um, for patients versus other potential surgical intervention.
Yeah, and it also strikes me that receiving this designation is a clear indicator that the U.S. views this as an undertreated patient population and unmet need, so to speak.
Yes, that absolutely is the case. There are not I mean, when we speak to physicians in the US, we've spoken to a lot of physicians over the last year since I've been here. I interviewed a number of neurologists, and they all say is there are good surgical solutions, but a lot of patients sub-select out of those solutions. They're given the option. So once they're identified as drug refractory, they're given the option for resection.
Just for the audience, resection, we're actually talking about removing a portion of the brain that is the source of the seizures. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. And you're not able to discriminate from the area of the seizure, and that could be over an eloquent area that has either motor abilities, speech abilities, or other types of aspects that could lead to side effects for that patient. So a lot of patients say no, and then they are given the alternatives for procedures that require more intervention, craniotomy. So opening a hole in the skull, putting electrodes into the brain, um, or putting an electrode attached to the vagus nerve. And a lot of patients will also say, "You're not opening my skull." Right? So giving them now, there were many physicians that said, I have many patients where they're at the end of their treatment pathway. We're managing them medically, but it's not adequate. And they've refused all these other alternatives. These are the patients that could be easy patients. These are the patients that if you presented them with a surgical alternative that doesn't touch the brain, that is just under the skin, and also if it doesn't work fully removable, there would be a large percent of those patients that would take advantage of that opportunity.
Right. So here you are, you're sitting, you have a technology that's gone through a rigorous process, has been approved and is commercial in Europe. You've now received approval to start a large clinical trial in the US. You're sitting at the intersection of BCI, so brain computer interfaces, and AI, which is, trends that everyone is focusing and talking about, and you're resource constrained. So, how do you determine how to prioritize and spend your time and attention? Because you can't tackle all these things at once.
So we are in a we have a very good partnership with our strategic partner, and they are working with us on a next generation product. That next generation product is a full BCI type product, right? So it's write out, read in its ability. So the ability to view signals from the brain and take that information, process that through an AI algorithm, which we already have and is already trained, and then develop a treatment pattern that is specific to that patient. Ultimately, working in a closed loop fashion, that's probably a little bit farther down the road. But the key for us is actually the electrode. The electrode array doesn't change. Now, in order to do that processing and so on, we need a new technology and a rechargeable technology to be able to uh, have enough power to do some of these other processes, the actual recording, and then also the processing and then transmission of the treatment pattern. So this partnership with our strategic is very beneficial in helping us develop that technology in a way that it's actually progressing quite nicely. And we're able to manage it in our current, in a financially, always a very strict financial environment.
Great. That is
Side
very exciting. Very exciting. I want to go back to your experiences abroad. I know there's a number of listeners that have contemplated or thought about going abroad, working as an expat, whether it's from the US to Europe to the US, or Asia to Europe, or what have you. I'm curious, what advice would you give to someone who's considering that or thinking about it? What advice would you give to professionals considering working abroad?
I think it starts with, where do you want your career to go? What is your end goal? I mean, I always had a kind of a 5 and a 10 year horizon that I was looking at, and I said, okay, where do I see myself in the 5-year period, and where do I want to be within 10 years? But not make it so rigid that you can't pivot a little bit within that structure. But having that kind of foundation is really important. And I set out, as I said before, to say, okay, ultimately in my career, in 10 years, I want to be of value to companies who are commercializing products globally and be able to provide them with insights and understanding that allows them an effective path to commercialize those products. So with that easy statement, uh, I start to chip away, right? So, okay, if I want to do that, I need to have exposure and experience in international markets. So, how do I do that? And then, yeah, I can only say that it's enriched my career. It's enriched my understanding of markets and understanding of people that I work with, understanding of customers in a different way, because perspectives of physicians in Europe are very different than Asia, very different than the United States. And then patients, right? So communicating to patients is always ultimately, in the end, the patient has to feel comfortable with the product that's in their body, and communicating a feeling of assurance that we've got their back, that they're taken care of, um, is really vital, and that takes work and effort from a marketing standpoint, right? So, um, my advice is always to people who are in medical device: if you want a long and robust career, you have to have exposure to international markets. The best way to do it is to get into the markets and take some risks, right? But you have to, if you have a spouse or a partner, they have to be on board for the journey.
Right,
If
right.
they're not
Yeah.
on board for the journey, it's going to end very quickly. Uh, so you have to have, that support system around you. But it can be, and you have to be willing to let go some of your preconditional stereotypes, right? You can't approach everything from the lens of your culture. If you do, you probably won't survive very long in an international environment. So you have to do some study of the dynamics of business internationally, in order to understand how different people perceive conflict, perceive uh, communication, and how they communicate, because it's very different.
Right,
So I can only encourage it. I can only say that it makes you a better professional, and a better, gives you the ability to communicate to a broader group than you would if you only spent your career in one market. Uh, yeah, I would encourage it. Uh, I would, there aren't many expat opportunities these days, and you have to kind of navigate it in your own way. And I always did that, right? So I only had officially like one true expat experience. All of the others were self-directed. So learning how to become a resident in a market, in a country, and so on, that was, you have to take some of that on yourself. Whereas if you're fortunate enough to get into an expat position, then they navigate that for you, but you should arm yourself with that knowledge as well. So it can be a challenge, but it's worth the effort.
yeah. So fantastic perspective. So I have to ask, last question, how's your German coming along?
Uh, that it's it's getting there a little bit. I mean, I definitely rely heavily on translation apps and other dynamics. The level of education, especially around the Heidelberg area, and the engineers and everyone that's working here, have fairly high level of English, and that's an advantage. It does limit my understanding of culture, and so is something that I encourage people to make an effort at. and it's something that, you have to continue to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for spending time with me and with us today. I think that the future for Precisis sounds extraordinary. So we'll be watching things closely and really appreciate your time today.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
for all of those listening, thank you so much for joining us today on Powering the Future Within. If this conversation inspired you, follow the show and share it with your MedTech community. I'm Omari Bouknight. Stay inspired and keep innovating.